All right, now let's talk about the proper way to create explicit measures. So we're not going to use the AutoSum shortcut anymore. Now we're going to actually write DAX to create explicit measures through our Power Pivot tab. So it'll be in the actual pivot table view, not in our data model, when we create these explicit measures. So in your Power Pivot tab, you'll see a button called Measures. And when you click New Measure, it'll open up the Measure dialog box that looks like this. So at the top of the dialog box, you've got information about the measure. Every measure gets assigned to a table so that you know where to find it in your pivot table field list. It's given a measure name. Again, you can use spaces here if you choose. And you've got an optional description. So that's kind of up to you if you want to use descriptions or not. Generally speaking, I'll add a description for the more complicated measures that might not be so intuitive, but I might just leave it blank for some of the simpler ones. So in the case that we're looking at here, we've defined a measure name called total quantity, just like the one that we created with AutoSum. We're assigning it to a table that's named Food Mart Transactions 1997, and we've given it a description. And the description won't show up anywhere except within this dialog box if we come back and manage our measures. Now, beneath the information, you've got the formula pane, and this contains the actual DAX code that we'll be writing, as well as options to browse the formula library with this little FX button, and check your formula syntax with the check formula button. Now that button is going to become our best friend. We're going to use it pretty much every time we write an explicit measure, even if it's kind of a simple measure, just because it is very easy to make mistakes, especially if you're relatively new to writing DAX. And quick note here, just like normal Excel functions that kind of offer that little helper box to guide you through a function, there's a very similar process here with DAX. They call it IntelliSense, and it's actually even more helpful than the traditional formula and function version because it helps to auto-populate things like formula names, table names, and column names, and it also does a nice job kind of letting you know when your formula is going off track. So, if a formula needs a table as an input and you're trying to write a column, IntelliSense is going to say, hey, stop what you're doing, this is not correct. So really, really helpful, especially as you're learning this language. Now, last but not least, we've got formatting options. These speak for themselves. Just give each measure a number format. If it's a percentage, calculate as a percentage. You can do currency, comma separations, all your standard formatting stuff right there. And that's it. Then you press OK and your measure has been defined. So quick pro tip, in the formula pane itself, you can actually hold Control and then scroll your scroll wheel on your mouse up and down to make that formula size larger or smaller. That's why it looks so big in the screenshot that you're looking at here. So that's the proper way to calculate some explicit measures. Let's jump into Excel and we're going to basically replicate that total quantity calculation that we just built with AutoSum using the measure dialog box from Power Pivot. Alrighty, we're back in our Food Mart data model workbook. I am in the pivot table view looking at the Power Pivot tab. And again, this is where I'm going to see that measures button where I can either manage existing measures or create a new one. So in this case, let's go ahead and create a new measure. Here's that measure dialog box that we just talked about. And in this case, I like to give it a measure name first. I kind of wish this was first in the list, but we're going to calculate something called total quantity. And because this total quantity is going to sum the quantity field in the transactions table, then it makes sense to assign this measure to that table. Just think about it. If we assigned that to something like the customer lookup, it would drop it into this customer lookup dropdown in my field list, which is very confusing. People won't be able to find it there. So total quantity, we're assigning it to transactions. And for a description, we could say sum of quantity field from transactions table, something like that. And now here in our actual formula pane, we're going to just start typing sum, and see that IntelliSense kicking in. You'll start to get familiar with what these icons mean, but this circle with an FX means it's a function. So if I haven't completed what I'm typing and I see the correct option has been selected, I can just tab, which kind of drills into it. And now IntelliSense is saying, okay, we've entered a sum function, The next piece that we need for this function is just the column name. So it's populated a list of all of my column names from all of my tables in the data model, which is pretty cool. And I'm going to want to use a fully qualified column, which means I'm going to start with the table name. So transactions. You see it's filtered down to only columns within transactions. And from here I can either manually continue typing, or I know that's the field I want. So I can select and either press tab or double click and it populates it for me. So sum of the transactions table quantity column, can close that out. And let me show you a little shortcut. The control wheel up just makes that grow. So sum of transactions, the quantity column within that transactions table. Now just to show you what the library looks like, you can insert a function and it gives you this little helpful reference library. Again, just like my formulas and functions course, I'm not going to use this. It's a nice way if you're learning and you want to play with different options, go ahead and explore that, but we're not going to be using it much in this course. What we will be using is the check formula button. So when you check it, this is what you want, this beautiful green check mark that says no errors in formula. And we're going to intentionally walk through some error messages so that you'll see kind of how to deal with them. But in general, this is what you want to see. So green check mark. Now, last but not least, how do we want to format this? Total quantity, it's going to be a number. And let's make it a whole number with 8,000 separator. And there you have it. Just press OK. Creates the measure. That measure pops up. And we're exactly back where we landed using AutoSum. So now we've got this measure that we can drop into the values field. If we go into our data model, into the transactions table, see in the calculation pane, it's populated that measure that we just created. You can actually write measures here in the calculation pane as well. I don't like to. I find it very messy and very sloppy. And you'll see once we create more and more measures, they all kind of just get stacked all over the place down here. So personally, I don't like using the measure pane, but it's nice that they kind of automatically get stored there if you do need to reference them. But otherwise, we'll go back to our pivot table view. And when we do need to edit or add or delete any of our explicit measures, we'll go into that measures tool from the Power Pivot tab, manage them from there. So there you go, total quantity, sum of the quantity column, transactions table. And there you go, that's the proper way to create an explicit measure.